So it's quite interesting really, because a lot of second generationers were never told about the Holocaust by their parents, but we were, my brother and I were. So I was very, very young when I became aware that my mother's story was different to the story of my friends' mums. So my name is Sandra Miller, and I'm first generation British. My parents were both Polish, and my mother was a Holocaust survivor named Sabina Miller.
I'm Barbara Warnock. I'm the Senior Curator and Head of Education at the Wiener Holocaust Library in London. We're in Russell Square near the British Museum.
So my name is Hannah Goldstone, and I am the granddaughter of a survivor, Martin Wertheim, who came over to the UK on the Kindertransport.
So here's the album. I have to handle it quite carefully. And then inside, the first page has got a map showing a route across Germany to Berlin. So what this album is it's an album of photographs recording these anti-Semitic signs that proliferated across Germany in the mid-1930s. So this one is on the left, interaction with Jews leads to exclusion from the village community. Recent research has actually uncovered that it wasn't a Dutch motorcyclist that took these pictures. It was a German-Jewish couple in a car with their dog, and you can see the woman there and the dog in the car. And our predecessor organisation, deliberately said it was a Dutch motorcyclist as a subterfuge to give a little bit of protection to the identities of the photographers, who in effect were carrying out an act of resistance by taking these photographs, documenting the kind of anti-Semitic atmosphere and persecution that Jews faced on the streets. We've always called these albums motorcycle albums, but in actual fact that's somewhat misleading, but then the subterfuge is part of their history.
My grandpa was born in Germany in the 1920s to a really normal, happy Jewish family. There was his mum and his dad and his older brother, and he had a really kind of normal upbringing in the sense that he used to go to the park, he used to go to his friend's house, he went to school, and then their world completely changed. The Nazis came into power, and it was then that I think the Jewish communities in Germany as well as Poland and in this country realised that the children needed to be saved. There had to be a way to get the children out, and so the British government said that they would accept 10,000 Jewish children from Czechoslovakia, from Germany, and my grandpa and his brother were just two of those children.
My mum was born in Warsaw. She lived with her family, who were a practicing observant Jewish family. The Warsaw Ghetto happened, and they were forced to live in a section of the city in terrible conditions. Eventually she made her way out of the ghetto and into the countryside. After a couple of months, my mum heard that there was a farm close by that needed some Jewish workers. And the reason it needed Jewish workers was because the Polish workers had been sent to Germany to work as slave labourers on German farms, because obviously German farmers had gone into the army. The owner of the farm came to them a day later and said, "The Germans are now coming for you. I'm telling you this because there's a river, the River Bug is nearby, and that means you could escape to other countries." But most of the girls chose to stay where they were, and my mother didn't understand why. It was probably that they'd been beaten down by the labour, and some of them said, well, most of our families are probably dead anyway. But she persuaded her friend Rushka this time to run to the woods behind the farm. Now, the thing about woods, forests, were that Germans were very frightened of them because that was where the partisans set about their business. And partisans were groups of young Polish men who fought against the Germans. So Mum persuaded Rushka, they went into the woods and they knocked on the door of various farms to be given bits of bread, bits of food. And on one farm, the guy said, "I know where you can stay." And he led them to a partisan dugout. It was like, I don't know how you describe it. It was in the ground. You couldn't walk into it, you had to slide into it. But it was a covered pit. And they lived in that pit for over 7 months in the freezing cold of a 1942 Polish winter. And eventually on one farm that she knocked on the door, there was a young girl sitting there crying. And the woman was trying to find out how well Mum spoke Polish. And she said to my mum, "How would you like to go to Germany? My daughter has just received papers to be sent to Germany to work on a Polish farm as slave labour, and she doesn't want to go because she has a boyfriend here." And Mum jumped at the chance. Now, when I was growing up, I never understood why would Mum want to go to Germany, which was a country that hated her because she was Jewish. But she explained to me that if she could go as a Polish slave labourer, she could live quietly for the rest of the war, have 3 meals a day, and she would be safe. So anyway, she immediately agreed to go. Unfortunately, while she was at the administrative centre, she didn't pass the medical, and she was accused of being Jewish. She was beaten up by the Gestapo and sent to a prison called the Pawiak in Warsaw, where luckily she was put in a cell with 9 Catholic girls rather than in the Polish cell, which would have meant her certain death. She was interviewed by the Gestapo a further 4 times and by some miracle was released. She went back to Skaraszewska, the administrative centre, and eventually traded places with a second girl and became Kazimiera Borkowska, and eventually was sent to Germany to work on a series of farms, and she was safe until the end of the war. She remembers the day that German soldiers left the farm and that British soldiers came into the farm where the war was over. She thought she was the only Jew left in Europe, and they didn't know what to do with her.
The Wiener Holocaust Library is a library and an archive and a museum, and we're actually the world's oldest and Britain's largest archive on the Nazi era and the Holocaust. Regrettably, there's sometimes quite a lot of Holocaust denial, or what you might call Holocaust minimisation or distortion, when in fact it's a very, very well documented event, at least in many aspects of it. And you know, the Wiener Holocaust Library's got a lot of that evidence, and it's got evidence from perpetrators, it's got evidence from victims, and lots of other types of evidence as well about what happened.
I think it's remarkable that people don't remember, or there's a lot of Holocaust denial that goes on. There are people who refuse to accept that it existed. I think the idea that 6 million Jews could have been murdered just because they were Jewish is sometimes too much for people to bear. But it wasn't just the Jews, and that's what people forget. It was people, the Romani, it was homosexuals, it was disabled people, anyone who was slightly other, the Nazis wanted to get rid of. And we must never ever forget that, because as soon as the other starts feeling like a danger, we start losing our humanity. And that was a message that my mum was really, really keen on stressing. She was the most tolerant person I know. So I'm a member of an organisation called Generation to Generation. And what they do is that they help the children and grandchildren of survivors to tell their story. So my mum died in 2018, and I always promised her that I would continue to tell her story, because for the past 20 years of her life, she went to universities and schools and synagogues and told her story. There's a scheme that's called March of the Living. And most people will have heard of the concentration camp of Auschwitz. And there are 2 concentration camps very close to each other, Auschwitz and Auschwitz-Birkenau. And what the Nazis used to do is march the Jews from one to the other. It was a march of only 4 kilometres. But because they were so ill and tired and malnourished, loads of people used to die on the way. So it was known as a death march. So we now have something called the March of the Living, where every year around April, groups of people from all sorts of countries in the world join and do this march together. And I was privileged to do it with my mum. On the day of the march, my mum has six granddaughters, and 4 of them were able to be there. And so we had 3 generations of us doing the march together. And the point about that was that what the Nazis were trying to do was get rid of the Jews. And our doing the march together meant that they clearly failed. So that was a very moving and very important day for our family.
I've pursued kind of Holocaust education from an academic perspective, kind of by accident. It was never ever something that I really saw myself going into. And then I saw an advert for this master's degree in Holocaust studies. That was kind of the course that I took. It was a year, it was intense, it was emotional. The research that kind of I read and the plans that I saw for things like Auschwitz, the gas chambers in Auschwitz, the plans that these big companies submitted. It was literally a list of, well, we can kill more people than the other company can. We can kill them quicker. And I think seeing all that information, all that data in black and white, for me, it kind of took it to a whole different level of how could this actually happen? And we know it did happen, but these were the mechanics of how it happened. So it just gave me kind of an incentive to go, okay, I've got this knowledge and I've got this information. I now kind of want to pass that on. And that's when I was fortunate enough to get my first lot of funding. And we came up with a really, what we thought at the time was a very innovative, different way of teaching students and children about the Holocaust. I work with my colleague Caroline, and we go into schools from kind of year 6 upwards and colleges, and we teach people about the Holocaust, possibly from a different perspective. So for me, it's from a very personal perspective. It's about my grandpa and his story and how what he went through at the age of 9 stayed with him for the rest of his life. But it's also about the implications that had on survivors later in life, and the implications that I think it has on the community and communities as a whole when something like that happens.
Okay, so I've got here a children's book published in Germany in 1938, and it's a very unsubtle piece of anti-Semitic propaganda directed at children. It's called The Poisonous Mushroom. The point is supposed to be that in order to avoid being poisoned by mushrooms, I've got to know the signs of mushrooms, that somehow, that Jews are very dangerous, but also might be hidden and you might not recognise them. So this is quite a famous illustration. So it shows a school and they're being taught to identify Jews, including in this offensive way by kind of caricatured pictures of Jews. And this is a really interesting document that we've got in the collection that it's a Jewish survivors report, and it's a document of Nazi guilt is how it's described. And at this point, the Wiener Library and others were trying to speak to survivors of the Holocaust where possible. And so this one is called 18 Months in the Auschwitz Extermination Camp, and Auschwitz is Auschwitz. Then it says that this is the first in a series of personal reports received by the Jewish Central Information Office from eyewitnesses. And then it goes through in quite a lot of detail, lots of different things. So life under German occupation, so his sort of pre-Auschwitz life, shadow of deportation, one section's called arrival at Auschwitz, the slaughter starts. There's evidence here about Zyklon B, the gas that was used to murder people. Lots of other horrifying details about tattooing, brutal members of the SS, information about who the inmates, as he calls them, were, information about who the SS were, and the names he can remember, and so on.
So this is probably my most treasured possession. It was a proper jacket. It was part of a suit that my grandmother bought my mum just before the start of the war. And my mother had it all through the war because she was wearing it. Sleeves were cut off and it's become frayed and very old. But it was the only possession she had other than a work permit, the only physical memory she has of her childhood. So it's very special to me, and she's passed it down to me, and I will of course pass it to my daughters, and I trust they will pass it down to theirs. And with this jacket, I'm hoping they will tell my mum's story so that it's never ever forgotten.